December 15th, 1946, 9:30 hours. Former military camp, Yorkshire, England. Elizabeth Clarke stepped off the bus into freezing rain, her two children clinging to her coat, and stared at what would be her family's new home. Row after row of curved metal huts stretched across the former army camp like giant steel barrels laid on their sides, each one identical corrugated iron, painted dull green concrete bases, small chimneys poking through curved roofs. Hut 12C. That was theirs. Elizabeth pulled the assignment paper from her pocket to confirm, though there was no mistake. The housing officer had been clear. It's temporary, Mrs. Clarke. 2 years at most. Until proper council houses are ready, you'll manage. Her husband Tom walked ahead carrying their suitcase. Everything they owned after their Birmingham flat was destroyed in the 1943 bombing. 6-year-old Annie and 4-year-old Robert followed their mother silently. They'd been living with Elizabeth's sister's family for 3 years, 5 adults and 4 children in a 3-bedroom terrace. Anything, even this, would be better than that overcrowding. Inside Hut 12C, Elizabeth's heart sank further. The space was approximately 20 feet wide and 15 feet long. One curved room with concrete floor, bare metal walls, 2 small windows, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. A wooden partition divided the space roughly in half, creating a bedroom barely large enough for the double mattress already placed there. The children would sleep in the living room on camp beds. No kitchen. Just the stove. No bathroom. That was in a separate block 50 yards away. No running water. There was a communal tap outside. The walls were already running with condensation. Despite the December cold, the whole place smelled of damp metal and coal smoke from neighboring huts. Tom set down the suitcase and turned to his wife, trying to smile. Well, it's ours. That's something. Elizabeth nodded slowly, fighting tears. She'd survived the Blitz, survived 3 years of crowding, kept her children fed through rationing and shortages. She could survive this too. Right then, she said, straightening her shoulders. Let's make it a home. The crisis nobody planned for. Britain won the war, but lost nearly 1/10 of its housing. German bombers hadn't just killed 60,000 civilians. They'd rendered 4 million homes uninhabitable or destroyed. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth, every industrial city bore scars. Entire neighborhoods were rubble fields. Families who'd evacuated to the countryside during the Blitz returned to find their homes simply gone. The government had known reconstruction would be needed. What they hadn't anticipated was the scale of the crisis. Housing shortage wasn't just about bomb-damaged buildings. 6 years of war meant 6 years of virtually no new construction. Young couples who'd married during wartime, soldiers returning and starting families, the natural population growth, all created demand for housing that hadn't existed. By 1946, Britain needed approximately 2 million new homes immediately, with another million needed within 5 years. The construction industry could manage perhaps 150,000 traditional houses annually if materials were available, which they weren't. Timber was rationed. Steel went to rebuilding factories and railways. Cement was allocated to critical infrastructure. Skilled construction workers were still trickling back from demobilization. Even bricks were in short supply. Many brickworks had been converted to war production and hadn't restarted civilian manufacturing. The mathematics were cruel. At maximum peacetime construction rates, with perfect material supply, which didn't exist, Britain would need 15 years to close the housing gap. 15 years of families living in ruins, shelters, or crushing overcrowding. Minister of Health Aneurin Bevan, responsible for housing policy, faced impossible choice: build permanent quality housing slowly, or provide temporary shelter quickly. The political pressure was immense. Families couldn't wait 15 years. Something had to be done now. The answer was already scattered across Britain, in hundreds of military camps. Nissen huts, 40,000 of them, emptying as forces demobilized and prisoners of war were repatriated. They were ugly, uncomfortable, and designed for soldiers, not families. But they existed. They were empty, and they could be converted to housing within weeks rather than years. It would be temporary. Nobody, not the government, not the families, expected otherwise. 2 years, perhaps 3 at most, until proper houses could be built. Just emergency accommodation to bridge the gap. The temporary solution would last 20 years for some families. The hut itself. Engineering's compromise. The Nissen hut was brilliantly simple engineering that made terrible housing. Major Peter Nissen designed it in 1916 for one purpose: shelter soldiers quickly and cheaply on Western Front. Semicircular corrugated iron sheets bolted to steel frame. Wooden end walls with door and windows. That was it. 6 men could erect one in 4 hours with just wrenches. The design worked perfectly for its intended purpose. The curved shape was structurally sound. Load distributed like an arch. No internal supports needed. The corrugated iron was waterproof, durable, and manufactured in standard sheets that fit together like puzzle pieces. The whole thing could be dismantled, transported on one truck, and reassembled elsewhere. For military use, the disadvantages didn't matter. Soldiers slept in rough conditions. That was expected. Barracks needed to house dozens of men temporarily, not families permanently. Nobody cared if they were cold in winter or hot in summer. They were shelter, not homes. But converting them to family accommodation meant confronting every disadvantage the military had ignored. Heat loss was catastrophic. Single-layer metal walls with minimal insulation meant whatever warmth the stove generated went straight through the walls. On winter nights, ice formed on the inside of the metal. Families woke to frozen water in wash basins, despite keeping the stove burning all night. Condensation was constant. Warm air from cooking or the stove hit cold metal walls and immediately condensed. Water ran down the walls, pooled on the floor, soaked into anything touching the walls. Clothes stored against walls developed mildew within days. The constant dampness was unhealthy. Chest infections were endemic in the hut communities. The curved walls were impractical. Furniture couldn't sit flush against them. The ceiling height varied, tall at the center, barely 5 feet at the edges. Storage was nearly impossible. Hanging pictures or shelves required drilling into metal, creating new points for water infiltration. Noise was maddening. Rain on the metal roof sounded like drumming. Wind made the whole structure rattle and creak. Neighbors' conversations carried through the thin walls. Privacy was acoustic fiction. The stove was inadequate and dangerous. A single coal stove, trying to heat 300 cubic feet of poorly insulated metal structure, was an impossible task. Families burned through coal rations in days, then froze. The stove created one hot corner and left the rest freezing. Small children had to be watched constantly to prevent burns. Several hut fires occurred each winter when desperate residents overfed stoves trying to stay warm. The Ministry of Health knew all this, but the alternative was families remaining homeless. Imperfect shelter was better than no shelter. The huts would be temporary anyway. Surely families could endure discomfort for 2 or 3 years. Converting military space to domestic life. Elizabeth Clarke spent the first week simply making Hut 12C minimally habitable. The Army had provided basic furniture, 2 beds, a table, 3 chairs, a wardrobe, but nothing else. No curtains, no rugs, no kitchen equipment, beyond a kettle and 2 pots. The toilet block, 50 yards away, had 6 stalls for the 30 families in their row. The queue at morning was half an hour long. She tacked up blankets as curtains to keep out drafts and create some privacy. She scrounged cardboard boxes from the camp office and made makeshift storage. She boiled water on the stove to wash the children in a tin basin. There were no baths, only cold showers in the communal block that the children were terrified of. Cooking was primitive archaeology. The stove's flat top served as a cooktop. No temperature control, just hotter near the firebox and cooler at the edges. She learned to cook like her grandmother had, one-pot meals, soups, stews, anything that didn't require precise temperature or multiple burners. Baking was impossible. No oven. The children went months without bread that wasn't queued for at the village shop. Laundry became a 2-day ordeal. Heat water on the stove. Wash clothes by hand in the basin. Wring them out. hang them on lines outside, if weather permitted, or inside near the stove if not. In winter, clothes hung outside froze solid. Inside they created even more condensation that dripped back onto everything. But slowly, incrementally, Elizabeth transformed the steel cylinder into something resembling a home. She made curtains from fabric, scrounged from her sister. She painted the wooden partition with whitewash borrowed from another resident. She arranged their few possessions, photographs of family, Tom's medals from North Africa, Annie's drawings, to create visual warmth the metal couldn't provide. The neighbors became essential. Mrs. Patterson next door had lived in the hut since early 1946. 9 months of experience made her an expert. She taught Elizabeth which parts of the floor stayed driest, how to manage the stove to minimize coal consumption, which local shops had best queues. She watched the children when Elizabeth needed to walk to the village for shopping. Mr. Singh, 3 huts down, a Sikh veteran who'd served in Burma, was genius with repairs. When Elizabeth's stovepipe came loose, he fixed it. When the door warped and wouldn't close properly, he planed it smooth. He never asked for payment. Helping neighbors was simply what one did. The community became its own support system because survival required cooperation. Families shared coal when someone ran short. They watched each other's children. They pooled rations for communal meals on holidays. They organized work parties to repair drainage or clear snow from paths. It wasn't chosen community. Nobody would have chosen to live in the huts. But necessity created bonds stronger than many peacetime neighborhoods achieved. Children in the tin town. For adults, the huts were a humiliating reminder of how far they'd fallen. For children, they were adventure. Annie and Robert Clarke adapted within weeks. The curved metal walls became pirate ship hulls or submarine interiors, depending on the game. The communal space between huts became village square, where 20 children played elaborate games of their own invention. The odd architecture became normal. They didn't remember living any other way. The hut communities had strange advantages for children. Dense housing meant dozens of potential playmates within shouting distance. Mothers could watch from windows while children played outside. The shared hardship created egalitarian environment. The doctor's children and factory workers' children played together because everyone lived in identical huts. But there were difficulties. Adults tried to shield children from the cold. Children woke with frost on their blankets. The noise, trying to do homework, while neighbors argued through thin walls. The shame. Classmates from proper houses in the village sometimes mocked them as hut people. Annie Clarke came home, crying one day after schoolmates said she lived in pig sheds. Elizabeth held her daughter and explained as gently as possible, "We live here because we have to, not because we want to. There's no shame in that. We keep our home clean and warm. We take care of each other. That's what matters." But she saw her daughter's face and knew the explanation didn't erase the hurt. The years that became a decade. 2 years at most. The housing officer had said in 1946. By 1948, Elizabeth realized that was fantasy. Council house construction was slower than promised. Material shortages continued. The queue for permanent housing grew rather than shortened as returning soldiers applied. The Clarke's second son, Michael, was born in 1949. Elizabeth brought him home from hospital to Hut 12C, now even more impossibly cramped. 3 children in a space designed for none. She made it work through organization that bordered on obsessive. Everything had its place. Nothing could be left out. Toys were rotated rather than all accessible at once. Tom found work at a local factory, but the wages barely covered expenses. They saved what they could toward eventual house deposit, but the goal seemed to recede as fast as they approached it. In 1951, they were told their council house would be ready within 18 months. In 1953, the estimate became within 2 years. By 1955, they'd stopped believing the promises. But they improved the hut incrementally. Tom installed better insulation, fiberboard panels behind the metal that made real difference. He built a small wooden porch over the door that reduced drafts. He somehow acquired a paraffin heater that made winter nights slightly less brutal. Elizabeth made new curtains from proper fabric, installed a mirror that made the space feel larger, painted the wooden partition cheerful yellow. Their neighbors changed over the years, as some families finally got council houses and moved out. New families moved in. Many were immigrants from Commonwealth countries. Arriving in Britain to find housing crisis meant living in the same temporary structures British families inhabited. The Patels replaced the Pattersons. The Williams family replaced the Singhs. The community's character evolved, but its cooperative nature persisted. Everyone needed everyone else. The huts forced mutual dependence that created grudging but real solidarity. The toll. Living in the huts took toll on health, relationships, and dignity. The damp and cold created chronic respiratory problems. Elizabeth's youngest, Michael, had recurring chest infections every winter. The camp clinic treated a steady stream of bronchitis, pneumonia, and rheumatic complaints. The lack of privacy strained marriages. Couples couldn't argue without neighbors hearing. Intimate moments required elaborate timing and whispered care. Some marriages failed under the pressure. The divorce rate in the hut communities was notably higher than in traditional housing. Mental health suffered too, though nobody called it that in 1950s. The constant cold, the noise, the impossibility of true privacy, the grinding poverty, the broken promises about temporary housing, these wore people down. Some residents became depressed, withdrawn, giving up on maintaining the huts or participating in community. Others became angry, bitter, lashing out at families or authorities. But most simply carried on, because what choice existed? They kept the huts as clean as possible, raised children as best they could, maintained what dignity was available in circumstances designed to erode it. Elizabeth Clarke developed a mantra. She repeated, when things seemed impossible, we're managing, we're together. That's what matters. On the worst days, when the stove wouldn't light, or the roof leaked, or the children were sick, and there was no money for coal, she'd say it aloud like prayer. We're managing, we're together. Most days, she almost believed it. The final departure. In spring 1957, 11 years after moving into Hut 12C, the Clarkes finally received council house allocation. Elizabeth read the letter 3 times, afraid to believe it. A proper 3-bedroom house. Indoor plumbing. Central heating. Garden. Available immediately. Leaving was strange mixture of relief and melancholy. The hut had been terrible. Cold, cramped, uncomfortable. Everything they'd hated about it remained true. But it had also been home for 11 years. Annie was 17 now. Had lived more than half her life there. Robert was 15. Michael was 8, and remembered nothing else. On moving day, neighbors gathered to help and say goodbye. Mrs. Patel brought tea and biscuits. Mr. Williams helped load their furniture. 24 children who'd played together in the communal yard watched the lorry being loaded. You'll visit? Mrs. Patel asked, though both women knew they probably wouldn't. The hut community existed because of the huts. Without that forced proximity, the bonds would gradually weaken. Elizabeth looked back at Hut 12C one final time before getting in the lorry. The curved steel had housed them through 11 winters and summers. Her children had grown there. She'd cried there, laughed there, despaired and hoped there. It was ugly, inadequate, and had been home. Thank you, she whispered to the empty hut, feeling foolish but meaning it. Then she climbed into the lorry, and Tom drove them toward proper housing and the future they'd waited 11 years to begin. The aftermath. The Nissen hut housing program wound down through the 1960s as Britain finally built enough permanent housing to absorb families. Some settlements were demolished quickly. Others lingered, partially occupied, gradually deteriorating, becoming eyesores locals complained about. A few families purchased their huts and invested in major renovations, proper insulation, modern utilities, structural improvements that transformed them into acceptable permanent homes. These modified huts occasionally appear in rural Britain today, their origins visible only in the distinctive curved roof lines. Most residents were relieved to leave. The huts represented hardship they'd endured but didn't want to remember. When housing historians tried to document experiences in later decades, many former residents declined to participate. The memories were too painful, not of dramatic trauma but of grinding daily difficulty, of cold and damp and poverty and broken promises. But some remembered with unexpected affection, the communities formed in hardship, the neighbors who became friends, the realization that family and shelter mattered more than comfort or appearance. In 1989, elderly Elizabeth Clarke was interviewed for a documentary about post-war housing. "Were the huts terrible?" the interviewer asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Cold, damp, cramped, everything you've heard. I hated them." She paused. "But they kept us together. We survived. My children grew up there. We made them homes because we had no choice. And somehow that made them real homes. I wouldn't want to go back. But I'm not ashamed we lived there. We did what we had to do." That perhaps captured it best. The huts weren't triumph. They were necessity. Families didn't choose them and didn't romanticize them, but they survived them, endured them, and occasionally even created warmth and community within their cold steel walls. 100,000 British families lived in Nissen huts between 1945 and 1965. Each family has their own story of cold winters and communal toilets, of coal stoves and condensation, of making do and carrying on. Together, these stories form an unglamorous chapter of British history, not glorious but real, not inspiring but honest. The steel cylinders they called home weren't monuments to resilience. They were evidence of housing crisis, government failure, and ordinary people adapting to circumstances beyond their control. The families who lived in them deserved better. They got corrugated steel and a stove. And somehow, impossibly, they made it enough.